And yeah, so I guess I wanted to just introduce this incredible OVR technology company that I was able to experience, and it totally blew me away. So that's why I'm bringing Aaron here, and I'm so grateful that Aaron can join us and share his incredible knowledge with all of us. So, Aaron, I was wondering if you could just introduce yourself briefly and tell us a bit about the thought process behind developing this olfactory VR system that you've developed.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Olivia, thank you for the kind words and thank you for inviting me to come here and talk with you today. Um, you still go down in history as one of the coolest Instagrams of all time. So it's an honor to be here. Uh, OVR Technology, my company started around a singular idea that we believe that spending time in the virtual world has the potential to dramatically and positively impact our lives in the real world. And the key to unlocking that potential lies in our sense of smell. And because our sense of smell has such a strong link to the limbic system in our brain, memories, emotions, motivations, and behaviors, that it not only makes the virtual world more realistic, but it makes it more emotionally engaging, more immersive, and therefore more effective, and the results and outputs more robust. So we developed a micro technology that delivers hyper realistic olfactory experiences in the virtual world by understanding user behavior. And as the user navigates the virtual world, it wirelessly receives signals about user behavior and then releases exactly the right scent or combination of scents at exactly the right time. It's spatial and positional. So rather than just thinking of scent as binary, on or off, as you get closer to and more distant from objects, the intensity of smell increases. And then you have the perceptional directionality as well, based on where your head is facing, where you're moving in virtual reality. We are focused primarily on the impact of olfactory virtual reality on health and wellness, as well as training and simulation for high-risk occupations, and of course, experiential, art, marketing, and brand experiences. We don't really focus on gaming and entertainment, which is, I think, where people's minds go to mostly when they think about virtual reality, and for good reason. Virtual reality is primarily a gaming entertainment tool for quite some time, but the use cases that have measurable results in healthcare, health, wellness, training, simulation are rapidly growing and are pretty astonishing. The technology has come a long way. So,
That's amazing. Thank you, Aaron. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about like what is the OVR? What is the object? Like what does it look like?
sure. I have it right here.
Yay.
I'm not sure how well you can see, but this is our olfactory technology attached to the bottom of a HMD or head-mounted display, which is the virtual reality goggles. So the olfactory technology I'll show again in a second, but it's really three interconnected components. The first one is the microtechnology itself. And the microtechnology itself doesn't use heat to generate the smell. So we don't damage the odor molecules, which is really important. We're also able to precisely control the amount of scent released to the degree of parts per billion and parts per million. The way it works is a piezoelectric driven microaperture plate releases nano droplets of scent based on commands from the virtual world. And because the device sits very, very close to your nose without actually touching you, you're able to release a very, very small amount of fragrance. So when you inhale, it stimulates the olfactory centers in your brain. And when you exhale, if there's any latent molecules, it clears them from the olfactory area. So that means it's extremely responsive. One of the most important engineering feats that we had to overcome was how to generate smell extremely quickly, but also clear or eliminate smell extremely quickly. So if you have let's say a rose close to your nose and you smell it, immediately when you take it away, you don't smell it any longer. So that means not only is it a more realistic experience, but multiple people can be experiencing different sensory worlds at the same time in the same room next to each other. So that's the microtechnology portion. The second of the three portions is software. So the software, as I said, intelligently understands user behavior. So as you're moving through the virtual world, we've kind of reimagined the sensory world rather than like this chaotic soup of hundreds of trillions of odor molecules swirling around us all the time. We've reimagined it as a set of geometries with predictable behavior. So these geometries are invisible, but as you collide with these geometries or multiples of these geometries, it triggers different types of odorants to be released from the microtechnology. And then finally, the third piece of the puzzle is our Scentware. So the Scentware lives in little cartridges that plug in and out of the olfactory device. Each one holds 9 individual scents for 9 individual odor impressions, or they can be combined to make compound impressions. And they're water-based, IFRA approved, and we create them for hyperrealism. Now, hyperrealism in the scent world is a very interesting topic because all scent is subjective, and scent memory associations, emotions are subjective as well. So we go about creating scents in a unique way. Well, part of it's not unique. We use our sensory expertise to go to a place or go to an event or go to a scenario and kind of be able to decode with our noses, okay, what are the important odorants? We also developed an in-field sampling technique. So it's really just headspace analysis, GCMS on the go, so to speak. So we're able to use some analytical chemistry to either validate or disprove our sensory model. And then what we do is kind of look on the bell curve of what are the most recognizable odorant components in each kind of sensory scenario, target those and use primarily those when we recreate the odors in our lab. So for instance, the forest where I am in the mountains of Vermont is dramatically different than the forest in the Canadian Rockies or Siberia or parts of China. But there are definitely some commonalities that we can target between those, things like isobornyl acetate, et cetera, cis-3-hexanol. So we're able to kind of highlight the common odorants while also using the GCMS and our sensory expertise to flesh out the ends to make them, to give them a sense of terroir, a sense of place. So all those three components work together. And the device itself, I can kind of pull off. It's about the size of a candy bar. It weighs an ounce or two. It's very, very lightweight. You don't really notice it. And then these scent cartridges just plug in, just like that. And there you go. So it communicates via Wi-Fi and Bluetooth with the virtual environment.
So, wow, thank you, Aaron. That was incredible. So just to, I guess, recap very quickly. So what's really amazing about that, what blew me away about the technology is this ability to, as you're doing something in the virtual world, it is instant. Like what you pull, you hold up the rose to your nose, you smell something, you put it down, and you don't smell anything anymore. And you can also have background scents while this is happening, and background scents that move in and out of your scent world. So this is, for me, that was like one of the biggest wow moments of your VR technology experience for me. And I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the different components, like what are the different sensory experiences I can have with your scent piece? Because usually from the other VR experiences I've had, like it's like just like there's either only one scent or it doesn't move quick enough out of the space. So what you've been able to overcome is really this cross contamination. If you could just highlight again, what is it exactly that reduces this cross contamination between scents and that can have this very realistic experience?
So because we're able to release scents so quickly and in such minute amounts, you're only really smelling it when the scent is actively being released. When the scent is not actively being released, there's no odor molecules for you to inhale and then trigger the sensory experience. So we're able to emit multiple different odor molecules at the same time, but then stop them very, very quickly. We're able to release them at a rate of um, 130,000 times per second. So obviously we can do either 1 or 130,000 odor emissions. And like I said, we're able to kind of dial that into parts per billion, not with 100% accuracy, of course, but that kind of that general degree of concentration. Um, and things like, geosmin, the smell of rain on pavement, where humans are sensitive to just a few parts per trillion in certain cases. You really don't want a lot of those. So we have water-based formulas that are themselves slightly dilute, and then we're able to control the intensity of the smell um, by modulating the amount that's produced per second.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're
And you
welcome.
were mentioning how there's a lot of applications, or a lot for VR, there's a big application is gaming or enterprise. And you were saying that you focus on health and wellness.
Mm-hmm.
So what is health and wellness in the VR
Mm-hmm.
space? I don't even really know about that. So if you could just share a little bit about that, would be awesome.
Yeah, so it's not something that has existed for a long time. So I think there's probably a few definitions, and I think we're still learning what we can do with olfactory virtual reality in the health and wellness space. Kind of like stepping back a little bit about what it might be able to do and what we are focusing on is when you think, or the way we think about it, is that virtually all human experience starts with sensory input. And that sensory input gets kind of processed in your brain, and the result, the output, is thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Now, in a health and wellness setting, if you have a high degree of stress, or you're very uncomfortable, or you have certain phobias, we look at those as outputs. So if we're able to completely control the sensory inputs, audio, visual, and olfactory, then we can, to a relatively high degree of certainty, predict and control the outputs, which would be, obviously, in the case of stress, we want to decrease stress and promote relaxation. So through uh, relaxing nature scenes in VR, with guided meditations that focus on mindfulness and breath work, and then recognizable and comforting olfactory support to those nature environments, people are able to quickly and kind of effortlessly de-stress. And stress is one that we really, really like talking about, because it affects everyone. They say that 90% of disease and illness, the root cause is stress. Stress can manifest in all different ways. It can be physical stress, emotional stress, mental stress, but it's something we all suffer from, and it compounds. When we become more stressed, it's not linear. We don't just get 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it's exponential. And so the more stressed we are, the more it affects our sleep, which affects our stress levels, which affects our job performance, which affects our relationships, and of course affects our physical health as well. And there's not that many ways to go about it in your daily life other than drugs and uh, well, recreational drugs and pharmaceutical drugs. And there's a lot of things like mindfulness that we know work. Breath work works, meditation works, exercise works, but you're not always able to do those. You also don't always want to do those. I think something that is really unique about VR is that you can go anywhere and be anyone and do anything. And to get the wellness benefits while you're doing that at the same time is very, very interesting and unique. And as traditional medicine shifts more towards integrative medicine, which is where we're focused, we see millennials spending more time at integrative health specialists than at their primary care physicians. We see a 5,000 increase in Google searches for integrative medicine over the last couple of years. We just see that is where people are looking for preventative medicine, for a holistic mind-body approach, and for their care providers to really treat them as a whole person. And this is a really, really pleasant and effective way to manage stress and promote well-being and relaxation.
So how would you measure? Um, like you said, you can measure. You have all the input. You know what inputs you're putting in. How do you
Mhm.
measure the before state and the after state of the person to actually say like this is making an impact?
That's another thing that people are still learning. So there's two ways to do it. There's self-reported data, and then there's biometrics. In a recent study at the University of Vermont Medical Center on the effects of olfactory virtual reality on pain, stress, and anxiety, they took vitals, non-invasive vitals, heart rate, pulse, and they combined that with self-reported data, really just a one to 10 scale, directly before the OVR experience, directly after the OVR experience, and then 3 hours after the OVR experience. And so, um, people benefited across the board, and the results were really, they were really interesting. They were really promising. There's a lot more research that needs to be done. And I think that VR, and I mean, I think all of us here probably know that olfactory period is very under researched. There's a lot we don't know about it. And so VR itself is under research as well. So the two of them together, there's very, very little research. So we're in the early stages of, what is the potential, what is the possibility, but we do know, you know, um, that in, let's say, training and simulation, a firefighter, a police man who's taking a test, the skills acquisition dramatically improves over classroom learning or 2D learning at least 4 times. So your brain and your body don't know the difference between what you do in VR and what you do in real life. And I think experiential learning is commonly understood as the best way to do it. So by experiencing something in VR, you're more likely to retain information. And by experiencing something in VR on the wellness side, it's more of a mind-body approach. You're more likely to get more benefit from it than just focusing on one sense or one activity.
For longer, with a longer impact.
Yep, exactly.
Um,
And it's compounding it. And I think VR could easily be something that is escapism, right? Like, oh, my job sucks. Let me just go in VR to get away from it. And that certainly is effective in the minute, but what we see in VR is the ability to acquire skills too. Breathing, meditation, mindfulness. Those are skills that you acquire, and also the results compound in a positive way, the same way that stress compounds in a negative way. So you can really combat stress, but also give yourselves the tools to manage that stress in a minute by minute basis when you don't have access to VR or time to breathe or meditate, which is a lot of all the day for a lot of us. So
right. Yeah. As long as we can bring what we learn in VR into the real world, I think that's really very, very powerful. Which brings me back to your mentioning the training. If you could just talk a little bit about how can olfactory VR help in training, that'd be awesome.
Oh, so there's a number of different examples that are both exciting and traumatizing at the same time. I'll use firefighting as an example, but this can kind of be applied to a number of different high risk occupations like police and rescue and military. But firefighters, their job is essentially to go into life-threatening, dangerous, traumatic situations that are really unpredictable and keep themselves and everyone around them and the property safe. So how on earth do you actually train for that? You just can't learn how to do that from a book or a video. And the most dangerous, we've all heard about the fight or flight response, right? But the most dangerous thing that happens is freeze. You fight, flight, or freeze. And when people are presented with too much sensory input that is unfamiliar with them, they're unable to process it. And as stress level goes up, your cognitive processing ability goes down, and you reach that threshold where you're frozen. You can't do anything. And that's when people get hurt, when people die, when property gets damaged. And so we spoke to a number of firefighters, and they all have these stories about how they went onto the scene, and if only they had known what that smell meant before they went into the gas explosion or the house, they would have had a completely different approach and probably a better outcome. So, on the one hand, there's day-to-day skills that we can see incremental improvements on in multisensory VR learning versus classroom learning. But I think the high impact situations are the ones where people's lives are on the line. And so when you look at field medics in the military, police officers, emergency response technicians, um, their jobs are extremely stressful, extremely dangerous. And if we can give them the tools to be more successful at their jobs, but also the tools to manage stress and cope with the emotional trauma, then that's like unbelievable. And like I said, even if it's marginal and there's not a ton of data yet, but even if it is marginal, it makes a difference. And I think it shouldn't go, unnoted that there's a huge economic benefit too, which incentivizes people to transition to, multisensory VR learning and multisensory VR for wellness rather than traditional techniques, which are lengthy, costly, and not as effective.
Right.
Mhm.
So got it. So then I was just thinking, so you can help in the training part, but what if like the firefighter has a very traumatic experience and like we know that there's training happening and that post-traumatic stress disorder is something that is just so prevalent, and so terrible. Like how can olfactory VR help with that, and how much of a difference does it make if you're doing post-traumatic stress with olfactory VR versus without? Have you done any work on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think all of us here, especially, can attest to the power of smell to create and retrieve memories. And so often, someone who has experienced a traumatic event and has some form of post-traumatic stress, even if they are actively working on processing that stress through in therapy, those olfactory triggers are really sticky and they're hard to work through and get rid of. And they're often the thing that can trigger you most emotionally and most unexpectedly. Um, and the kind of the gold standard for managing the symptoms of PTS is exposure therapy. So that's when, in a safe, controlled environment, a clinician will walk the patient through the traumatic experience and allow them to revisit and reprocess the difficult memory. They do that a number of times and work towards what's called extinction. So even though the memory itself doesn't go away, you process the emotions that are associated with it. So you no longer are experiencing the same kind of emotional triggers that lead to everything that people experience, from nightmares and sleeplessness to substance abuse, depression, anxiety. So I do want to be really, really careful here about how I phrase this, because in no way are we treating PTSD.
Okay.
We're not medicine, so we're not treating PTSD, but we are interested in the research, for instance, that Skip Rizzo is doing at the University of Southern California on a program that he calls Brave Mind, which he is interested in using to treat um, uh, uh, Army veterans who have PTS. And so clinicians will use this as a way, instead of putting the pressure on the patient to revisit those memories on their own, to give them visual, auditory, and then, of course, when the time is right, olfactory stimulation to retrieve those memories and process them more quickly and efficiently. So there has been a lot of great anecdotal evidence around that. And of course, we're supporting his research, and we think that, this is a direction that managing post-traumatic stress could go. And of course, the olfactory component is a critical part of that.
Cool. Yeah, I'm guess I'm going to be curious about seeing exactly like how much more impactful it becomes when olfactory gets comes into play, right? And in our conversation last week, we were talking about how great when you're using olfactory to tell stories, you can create very realistic stories. And you were mentioning how really great storytelling makes people
Mhm.
do things. And I'm just wondering if you could um, elaborate a bit on that, because I thought that was so interesting, right? Like how does storytelling or great storytelling make people bring people to action?
Absolutely. I think like a really good storyteller will tell you a story, and from the other side of the table, you'll be entertained and you'll enjoy it. But great storytellers truly bring you on their side of the table and bring you into their world, and you feel like it's happening to you. And virtual reality, to me, is the greatest, most powerful storytelling tool ever, because it truly puts you into the story. You're not a passive bystander. You're not watching it. You're not just noticing it. You are living it. So there's a a ton to me of incredible examples of how virtual reality can inspire empathy, for instance. One of our friends and partners at Stanford University at the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, Jeremy Balanson, is really, really into how VR can inspire empathy. So one of his most powerful demonstrations it allows you to personify a Black male and live the life of that Black male from childhood through adolescence through adulthood. And you get to experience like microaggressions, implicit bias, and racial violence in that experience in a way that you could never experience by someone telling you. As a white man, there's no way I would ever be able to experience that level of empathy other than doing it like this. And so it's incredible. And I think that um, using VR as a way to shine a light on something, but also kind of inspire people to act on a cause is incredible. But it's also a great way to get people to fall in love with what you love. Um, I think that perfume advertisements are an incredible example of creative storytelling trying to bring you into kind of this mythical world and get you to feel an emotion and fall in love with this idealized version of yourself or the world. And so to draw people into a virtual world and be able to give them sensory inputs that truly makes them feel like a different person or they're in a different world, you treat that as an experience that happened to you and not as a story that someone else told. And you internalize the emotions and the memory of what happened to you in the virtual world. And that is incredibly powerful. I have memories of time spent in the virtual world as if it were a quote unquote real memory. And so when you have complete control over the world, you have complete control over the experiences you have, and those experiences, memories shape who you are and what you do and how you live and your motivations and behaviors. Powerful.
Wow. So
Mhm.
is it something like the uncanny valley? Is there like a place, if it's so realistic, because if it feels just like your real world, um, is there a point where it works less? You know what I mean? Or does it have to be slightly different from like my reality right here?
Mhm.
Like what's the level of realism that is necessary to create these transformations?
Absolutely. So realism is an interesting word for it because I think a lot of people assume that the more quote unquote realistic the virtual world is, the better it will be. And so a lot of what people go to first is how real does it look? Is it photorealistic in quality? And what we know from our experience and what some of the research shows is that it's not so much that it needs to look photorealistic, but it needs to behave in congruent with our expectations of the world. So physics is very important, right? So things need to behave physically like you would expect them to in the real world. And that's a huge one. And that's one of the most difficult parts of creating virtual worlds. Another component is your like expectations on the sensory side. Things need to sound like they look like, and they need to smell like you think they're going to smell. And so realism is a tricky word because who's to say what that is, or even if that's like quote unquote important. So in the virtual world, we think of like, okay, what's the desired outcome? In the case of a video game, it's entertainment. So what kind of things entertain people? In the in the training and simulation world, it's are they going to acquire skills more quickly and effectively? And you can measure that with testing and performance. In health and wellness, it's do people feel better? Are their vitals better? Do they have better health outcomes? And so you kind of like all these inputs, you dial those inputs to produce those results. Eventually, we're going to get to the kind of Ready Player One, where you're going to not be able to tell the difference between the real world and the virtual world. And that's already starting to mesh with AR and the metaverse. But right now, um, I would say the uncanny valley does exist in VR, where you look at that and go, wow, and it's really, it really exists the same way the uncanny valley does in real life with people, right? When you look at someone and that it's a virtual representation of them, but it, yeah, God, it feels really, it feels really real, but it doesn't look quite real, you know? So I think the uncanny valley exists, um, but it's not as creepy as
Right.
some of the robots that I've seen.
Right. So just like I guess on another angle, I was wondering if so do people notice that there's a scent like for your wellness experience? Like people are having this breathing meditation experience, do they notice that there's scents or does it just become part of their expectations? Well,
We hope that it becomes part of their expectations. And if we do our job well, for the most part, they don't notice unless we want them to. And so we think about it like this. There's three levels of immersion when it comes to olfactory in VR, and they all have different purposes. And the best way I can describe this is if you're walking down the street in any city, like say New York City, you're walking down the street in New York City, minding your own business, the city has a smell, but you're not really noticing it for the most part. It's just kind of an ambient smell. And though it is subconsciously affecting you to a degree, it's not something that your focus is on for the most part. And I know if any of you live in New York, you're probably going to be like, well, I disagree. I really notice the smell of New York in the spring, and we can definitely have that conversation. But generally speaking, there's an ambient environmental smell. Now, when you're walking down that street, you might catch a whiff of pizza coming from a pizza shop. You weren't looking for it, you weren't expecting it, but it's novel enough and strong enough where it catches your attention and your focus shifts to, oh, I noticed that. That's interesting. Your brain goes, you know, let me decide what that is and what to do about it. So that's the second level. The third level is if that smell causes you to change your behavior or your thinking, and maybe you go inside that pizza place, you see a piece of pizza, you walk towards the piece of pizza, you pay for it, you pick it up, you smell it, you eat it, you buy it. That's the third level of interaction and intentionality. So each three of those three levels and kind of in between has a different function in the virtual world. And once again, it depends on what the outcome we're looking for is. So most of the time, the olfaction is there to support the audio and the visual world and make it more immersive and more engaging. But often in breath work, where you carry a virtual flower around with you, and that flower represents your deep breathing, and it reminds you to deep breathe when you see it. And it's also something that you can return to if you have intrusive thoughts or uncomfortable thoughts. You can take your flower, you can inhale deeply, and that kind of centers you and focuses you. And where if you were just trying to do breath work on your own in a busy cafe or your work from home office, it's much more difficult.
right.
Mm.
Got it. That's amazing. So when we're talking then about transformation and these skills and things that we could be learning, how like for a fragrance brand, I'm thinking about a fragrance brand, we're probably not trying, I mean, some fragrance brands now are being more active and in so based on a support, you know, they're supporting different causes, but for the most part fragrance brands are here to, you know, help us dream and feel more confident. So if I was going to do a collaboration with a fragrance brand, how could I like how would I help somebody feel more confident through a scent? Is this like just from your experience? I was wondering if you had any ideas.
Sure. You know, and confidence is an interesting one. I think each person might feel confident from a different type of virtual scenario. You know, and I think the brands know very well who their audience is and how to, you know, what their triggers are, you know, how to make them feel confident and sexy, or creative or avant-garde. And um, they do everything they can to create a multisensory experience to promote that. You know, Hermes is one of my like favorite examples of them controlling everything about your Hermes experience when you walk into that store. They don't even call it a store, they call it a universe, right? And everything is thought of, everything that you see and touch and smell has been analyzed to elicit a certain type of feeling and reaction. Um, you know, down to you know measuring top type font from, yeah, so everything is so curated,
Right.
and still you know you're in a store. Um,
Right.
and to be able to put you in a world that is this idealized version of the world that you want to exist, and you get to be the person that you want to be. That absolutely can create confidence. And there's a lot of like evidence, this is a little bit corny, but the kind of like power posturing, right? There's evidence that shows power posturing can give you more confidence. And the fake it till you make it idea. If you believe you're one thing for a while, you'll be able to get there. So by experiencing what it feels like in the virtual world, you're able to carry that over. And at first it might be just for a few minutes, but you might get more and more used to it. We heard an interesting, during an interview with a behavioral psychologist, we heard an interesting thing that came up in wellness where we're talking about, oh, like, how do you use this to make people feel better? And she said, well, a lot of people who come into my office don't know what it feels like to be relaxed. They've never felt that in their entire lives. And so
Wow.
if you give them an anchor point, then they know what to work towards. So if you can give someone an emotional anchor point in a multisensory VR world, then they know what that feels like, and they know what it feels like when they're not there either. So it can give them something to work towards, and then they can develop the internal tools and the skill sets and that kind of internal confidence that translates to the real world.
So then you can be the main model in the
Mm-hmm.
fragrance ad, and you could live the world and look down and feel like her, perhaps. And all your interactions will be just like in a 2D fragrance ad. I'm just trying to think very one to one, so it's easy to
Yeah,
understand. And
that's absolutely right. And you actually phrased it better than I did the other day when we talked, which is take the 2D fragrance advertising marketing material and turn it into 4D multi-sensory world, and live that world, be that person, be the model in the fragrance ad.
right, because I feel like it could be used for, you could smell the fragrance, but you can also learn about fragrance composition, for example, learn how it's
Mhm.
composed, how it was created. But there could also be, as you said, the New York City smell in the background and these other scents that make the world feel really real, and they're operating in the background. So that's what I
Mhm.
think is super amazing and powerful. So if a fragrance brand wants to work with OVR, like, how does this work, for example?
It could work a number of different ways, but essentially it would be a little bit like working with a traditional creative agency where you would come to us and say, here's the creative brief, right? Like, this is who we're targeting. This is how we want them to feel. This is the kind of the outcomes that we desire. And then there's a little bit of back and forth, and we decide, yeah, to your point, do we want a big reveal with the single fragrance? Or do we want to break it up into accords and tell the story of the ingredients? It can mean a number of different things. And then we would partner with one of our content creation partners and basically take that idea and turn it into the virtual world. And then we would either recreate or we would take perfume concentrate and then reformulate it to work in the ion device. And we would hand over the virtual experience to you, and you could deploy it all over the world. Um,
Ooh, amazing.
yeah, and just like a traditional creative agency, there's so many options about how long that could take and how expensive it is and how in depth. We can make a feature length, photorealistic, immersive VR experience, very expensive, and we could also make something relatively cheap. I think it was Bulgari a couple years ago did a VR experience, and it was amazing, like how they were thinking about it, that they were getting into the immersive digital space, but it was a fairly low budget VR experience in itself. And that's not like a qualitative statement about Bulgaria. That was just, I think, the technology available at the time that was deployable. But it could be really, really engaging and immersive, and
I
kind of
really
incredible. Yeah.
really look forward to experiencing that one day. But so what do you think needs to happen? I mean, this would be on a brand level. Brands could have these sets. But what do you think needs to happen so that everybody could have an OVR on their VR headsets? Like,
Mhm.
what needs to happen?
There's a few things that are happening right now. And even though COVID has accelerated a few of these things, There's still some time before olfactory virtual reality becomes commonplace for all of us, before it's like a cell phone and we all have one in our pocket. One of the things that needs to happen is the cost of the technology. Right now, VR is less expensive than it ever has been, and the quality is higher than it ever has been, but it's still not accessible to everyone. It's still hundreds of dollars to get into it. And because VR is so expensive, or relatively expensive, and not that many people have it compared to a cell phone, there's not as many companies generating the content for it. You know, think about what your iPhone would be like if there were no apps, right? It would be useful, but not anywhere close to how powerful it is right now. So more people need to have headsets and more content needs to be available on those headsets. Now, what's going to drive that is whether you like it or not, 5G. 5G, as it gets deployed more and more at an infrastructural level, will take the computing power off the headsets onto these edge servers. So the headset itself will be very cheap, and it itself will not be an interesting technology, right? It will just be viewed as an access point to this incredible virtual world. And everyone will have one, and you'll see them everywhere. They'll be in airports, at bus stations, they'll be all in cafes, they'll be everywhere. And you'll be able to access the virtual world through any of these access points. One of the things that's going to happen too, just like Hulu, just like any other form of media, is that there's going to be sponsorship and advertising. So perfume brands will sponsor content. It could be wellness content, it could be educational content, it could be entertainment content. And to experience that content for free, you're going to be exposed to uh, immersive brand experiences, and you're going to create emotional relationships with the scents that you smell in the brands. Um, so we're going to see a few worlds coming together. We're going to see the virtual reality, the technological world. We're going to see education, health and wellness, and fragrance coming together all in this one spot in the next few years.
That is amazing. And I can't wait for it all to come together. Everybody for joining. And thank you, Aaron, so much for your time and your incredible knowledge and sharing with all of us here. So, with that, I guess I'm going to just wish everybody a beautiful rest of your Tuesday. And I hope to connect with everybody soon. Send me